Thanks, Sue Ann. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So the title of my message today is, Am I Offended or What? Some years ago, we lived in the People's Republic of Cleveland Heights, an inner ring suburb of Cleveland. It was a great place to live. Our twins had been born just after we arrived. We moved there in 1989 and were making friends and meeting our neighbors. One of our neighboring households, two older ladies who were sisters, were always happy to see us and talk. One day, another neighbor had a yard sale, and these ladies put out a sign on their front porch that they had a typewriter for sale. My wife Joy said to them as she was buying the typewriter, "How clever of you to take advantage of the yard sale next door to sell your typewriter." Well, that was pretty much the last time we ever talked to them. We would wave at them, but get no response. We did wonder what had happened, but we were busy with our little children and didn't give it much thought. In passing a year or two later, one of the sisters told Joy that she had upset them greatly, particularly the older sister. This is because Joy had accused them of taking advantage of their neighbors. Joy was stunned and explained that no harm was meant, that she was, really genuinely complimenting them on, being clever, but we pretty much never talked to them. They were offended by these words of taking advantage. Joy and I have talked about this situation a lot. As Joy's spouse, I can assure you that she's a person of great patience and great compassion to others. She genuinely thought it was clever of these older ladies to get this typewriter sold at the same time as the other yard sale, but she thought that she was paying them a compliment. But so the question is, where did this interaction go wrong? Was Joy wrong? Was Joy wronged? Where did these nice ladies get offended? In this message, I'm talking a bit about being offended. I first read some thoughts about being offended in a column by the Boston Globe columnist Jeff Jacoby, who is a Jewish Stoic guy who is a good writer, a great writer, and a thinker. His thoughts on being offended are quite interesting, and his column can be found by a search online. The chalice lighting today was a Jewish prayer which he quoted in that column. And, so if you notice that prayer, and you might want to look at the prayer later, there's some similarities to the Lord's Prayer in there, the part about trespasses and such. So what does it mean to be offended? The definition of being offended is a feeling of displeasure, anger, or resentment. So we might say someone is offended by a speech. Hopefully some of you will be offended by my speech. It's a phrase that describes the feeling that some get because of others' actions, words, or opinions. In our society today, it seems like a lot of people spend a lot of time being offended. Sometimes people are offended because others, mostly people like me, do not use the pronouns they expect. In colleges and universities, people are offended because when persons of other political beliefs get jobs. People are offended when someone says politically incorrect words. A recent example of this came about when someone was talking about free speech, and they quoted a title of a book which included the famous N-word. I was going to actually say the N-word, but if I did, this message would probably not be allowed to be posted on YouTube, so I decided just to stick with the usual circumlocution. Even quoting a title is forbidden. If you read the actual words in Huckleberry Finn aloud, you can lose your job because the words in Huckleberry Finn, that famous word, is very freely used. Recently, students were offended when a teacher showed a movie made in the 1960s which showed Laurence Olivier, the great actor, wearing blackface, playing the Moor of Venice, to the point where the teacher was actually removed from the classroom. In Princeton University, a tenured faculty member, Joshua Katz, a very learned man who could speak many ancient languages, Hittite, Aramaic, and so forth. He was fired despite his tenured status because he dared to say that some anti-racism actions did not make sense. Being offended has been weaponized in our society, and it can have bad consequences for the person who commits an offense to offend. Sometimes offense is taken due to a lack of respect or being dissed by others. Media outlets all too frequently report stories of gunfights and mass shootings in communities where young men with access to powerful weapons shoot at each other, apparently when they feel angry or dissed by others. So, why is the state of being offended so rewarding? What is it about being offended which it pays you back, which makes you feel good? Well, when someone is hurt or angered, they can sometimes allow themselves to wallow in sort of a resentful, self-righteous, and self-justified set of feelings. The state of being offended is justified usually by some principle or another. So if, for instance, a politically incorrect term is uttered, the offended person, the listener, can claim that the speaker is a sexist or racist, a thisist or thatist, or something of that sort. And this gives you the satisfaction of feeling the moral superiority of being in the right. What a boost to your ego. Wow, you are better than that other worm. And this justification then leads the offended person to self-righteously lash out and correct the other person who did the offending. All of us can be guilty of this at one time or another. The teaching moment is not one that we all agree upon, however. When one person teaches someone else, that can be a difficult situation. It can be sort of a power play. Being offended, you want the other person to do something that is right, to apologize, to retract their statement, to change their opinion. You can, in fact, exact more than symbolic action against them in some cases. This is where people end up being canceled. Let's be clear about one thing. When you're offended in a normal interaction at somebody else's statement, it's usually because a matter of opinion is being discussed. It's usually not a matter of factual statements. The offended state is common because we all have opinions. And as Tom Bodett, the comic, says in the Red Roof Inn commercial, the problems begin when you share them with other people. There are certain opinions that are held universally in our society, such as the opinion that a person's religious belief or sex should not impact their ability to get a job. But other opinions are not universally shared. Some today think that what was called Columbus Day should now be called Native American Day, and that's in fact what we do here in the state of South Dakota. Those who hold that opinion may not remember, or perhaps they don't even know, that Columbus Day was designated as a holiday partly due to the discrimination at the time against persons of Italian heritage. When we interact with somebody whose opinion differs from our own, our first instinct is an emotional one. We often choose not to listen to that person, but immediately begin thinking about defending our own opinion. So, what's a normal interaction between people? Well, there's two kinds of interactions, really. There's normal, friendly discussions with people, and then there are hostile interactions. I'm not really going to spend much time talking about hostile interactions unless you spend a lot of time in certain bars in Sioux Falls or deal a lot of meth. Is there anybody here who's a meth dealer? Okay. Maybe you have a lot of hostile conversations, but most people don't spend their time in hostile conversations. A key part of our discussion with other people is what is termed the, quote, principle of charity. The principle of charity is really a very simple idea. You, as the listener, are asked to give the most generous and kind interpretation to the words of other people. The principle of charity leads us to believe that if someone uses an unfortunate choice of words, that in fact the unfortunate choice of words are simply that. They're not meant to be harmful or hurtful. It's just the words they've chosen. We're all familiar with the golden rule: treat others as you wish they would treat you, and the principle of charity is sort of related to that golden rule. So the difference between a normal and a hostile situation then is the intent of the speaker. If a person has hostile intent and they're attempting to attack you, that's one thing. And like I say, I think most people don't have too many of those conversations. In the common situation, the usual situation, the speaker has no such intent. We should listen with this principle of charity and try to take others' words as in the spirit in which they are intended. So that's the position of the listener, listening with the principle of charity. What about the speaker? What is the responsibility of the speaker? Most of us are polite. Most of us are reasonable people. Ones of us who are still alive anyway. We don't usually like to say things that are unintentionally bad or unpleasant. So part of the principle of charity is to be charitable, to be a nice person, to say things that are nice, and to avoid saying things that are difficult or offensive or bad. Speakers, though, are in a difficult position. When a person speaks to more than one other person, it's difficult to say something which isn't a problem for at least one of those people. If you speak to many people, some things that you say will bother some of those people. If you speak to 2, 3, 100 people, you are going to offend someone. And so the speaker should try as best as they can to not be offensive, but it's very difficult to say things to a large group. In college campuses, for instance, today, the comics are becoming increasingly reluctant to go onto those campuses because of the problem of offending people. It seems like college students are often feeling their offensive vitamin O, I guess you'd say, their offensive quality, and they get offended at all sorts of things. Some comedians seem to have risen above the offensive cancellation thing. Dave Chappelle, who's a fairly well-known guy, his mom actually, her name was Yvonne Sion. She was the first African-American UU minister, so he's got a connection to UUism. He's been accused of transphobia and a bunch of other things, but is weathering that storm well. Ricky Gervais, another comic, is been charged with all sorts of things. But these guys are well known, and they sort of are above the able to withstand the storm. There is one difficult area. This is the area termed microaggressions. Most of you have probably heard of microaggressions. Microaggressions is a statement that's not overtly hostile, but one which some people find difficult and other people perhaps are not aware that it's difficult. So, for instance, if you say that someone is well-spoken, this would apply to certain people. This may be considered a problematic or concerning thing. The microaggression thing is difficult because it's kind of a one-sided. The listener believes that what you're saying is a microaggression. You're just speaking, and you don't know what you're saying is wrong. So it puts it puts all the power into the listener. And if a listener is listening for microaggressions, they're not really operating on the principle of charity. They're operating on the principle of finding problems. Most people, when they're aware of the microaggressions, most people don't use them, but it's sometimes hard to do that. Many of the ideas about being offended are somewhat related to Stoic ideas. I've talked about Stoicism here in the past, and the Stoic notion of you control some things, you work and attempt to fix things you can control, but not the things that you cannot. What can you control? Well, the first thing you can control is yourself. Your own reactions are in your control. The reactions and statements of other people are not in your control. So a Stoic notion about being offended says you should try as best you can to control your emotional responses to things you hear. You cannot change the speaker, even your own children. You begin with complete control over your little person that has come along to bless your life. But soon that little person develops their own little thoughts. They want the green bib, not the blue bib. They want the applesauce, not the spinach. So soon that little person becomes out of your control, and you really have lost the ability to direct them. And it's shocking how quickly that happens, as anyone here who has been a parent knows. We don't control our children, we control ourselves. So being offended is thus really a choice. It's a choice that you make. So how then do you manage to control yourself? What are simple techniques? Most of you know what these are already, so I'll just mention them in passing very quickly. The first and simplest idea is try not to respond quickly. When you hear something that you find difficult, don't respond right away. Try your best to control your own sense. You're going to feel in some cases that flush of emotional response that sometimes is called a pre-emotion or a first emotion. You don't need to respond on the basis of that, and if you do, things can kind of go downhill. So you want to try to first of all not respond. It's also important not to be defensive, not to apologize in the most case, but simply to find a way of deflecting the situation. Maybe use a little humor to ease the tension. A key idea is that we feel offended because we value our own opinions more than the opinions of others. We have a high regard for ourselves. I certainly have a high regard for myself, and many of you probably do as well. And so when someone says something which directly challenges our opinions, our thoughts, it feels like we're being attacked. So it's key to remember that everyone has an opinion, and those opinions differ. Everyone's opinion is going to be different. Most people's opinions are going to be, well, some people anyway, will have a different opinion than you, and that's allowed. We don't require that everyone have the same thoughts. Certainly not in this church. What about when someone says something that's factually incorrect? Should you be offended that someone says something which is clearly wrong? Well, isn't that silly to be offended when someone says something that's clearly wrong? Don't be so on your high horse as to is to tell them off. And there's another important thing. Sometimes you are wrong. I've been wrong. And sometimes I am wrong about things that are obviously factually correct. And when I correct someone and they explain to me the actual situation, you do look rather silly at that time. Sometimes you do offend people. And what can you do about those? Well, you can try to learn from the situation. You can try to change your words. Maybe you use a phrase which was inappropriate. Maybe you shouldn't use that phrase. And the most important thing, I think, is to try to be kind and to try to be reasonable to other people. Use the principle of charity in listening. Use the principle of charity in speaking. Try to be a reasonable person. So, in conclusion, the phrase I'm sure you've been waiting for the last 10 minutes. What? Oh, you have to cash the in conclusion card one time and one time only when you're actually at your conclusion. So when you're in a conversation, use the principle of charity. If a word or phrase offends someone, that listener is in charge of their own emotions. Being offended is, in the last analysis, a choice that we all have. The listener should choose not to be troubled in a normal conversation. It's a matter of habit as well. If you're in the habit of being offended, and you do it all the time, you will become offended at the drop of a hat, even though most people don't wear them these days. But you will be offended easily and quickly. So you need to try to get out of the habit of being offended. Soon you'll have no friends. I don't have any friends anyway, but the few that I have would soon be gone. So if you're in the habit of thinking the best of people, you'll likely enjoy the fellowship of those as much as you possibly can. So the final statement is, being offended is a choice. You may choose to be offended, and I recommend that you try to do that as much as you can. Thank you very much.